Hello and welcome to another episode of Game, Develop, Repeat. I'm your host, Chris, and in today's episode, we're talking about consequences in games. What makes them satisfying, what makes them frustrating, a few examples of games, and how I feel about the consequences that occur in those games, and what we as game developers can learn from that, and how I've tried playing games from a different angle than I usually do, and how that changed my satisfaction with the experience of playing a game. Are you familiar with the choices matter genre? This genre of games where you pretty much are just making decisions. So it's like these horror games, it's games like The Quarry, it's games like Until Dawn, it's Detroit Become Human, Heavy Rain, all of these sorts of games that are very, very story oriented. And in my brain, I think of them, perhaps inaccurately, as the Goosebumps novel of gaming. Right, the choose your own adventure, not Goosebumps. Were they the ones that did all those choose your own adventure novels? I'm not 100% sure. I think they were. But it's the choose your own adventure novel of gaming. And I think this is a good spot to start this because the consequences in these games feel weird to me. I was watching gameplay of The Quarry the other day, and I went through and I watched a couple like alternative endings and different paths and stuff, just to glance at it, and I couldn't help but notice that the consequences don't seem that big in terms of how it would feel replaying the game. It's like they make minor adjustments that are significant, right? It's like, oh, this person died, this person didn't. Major changes. But in terms of actually playing the game, I don't think you're going to feel a lot of the impact of that. And the moment that clicked for me was I was watching this gameplay and I saw a scene and I knew that there was a path you could go through. I'm not going to hit spoilers, don't worry. There was a path you could go through where one of these characters was previously dead, okay? And so there's a scene where I could tell that they set up the scene so that if the other character was dead, it would basically be the same scene. You know? I was watching it and I was like, okay, so I know that that character could be dead at this point. How would this be different? Would they be in a completely different scenario? What would be going on? I was like, oh no, they just toss this character back in and then they remove them back out, and you can't actually make decisions that genuinely interact with this character because they've got to set it up so that if this character is dead here, they don't have to make a whole new scene, right? It's like a practical choice. And that struck me as an interesting illusion, an effective illusion that pulls away from the impact of your choices. And this is interesting in terms of the game development side of things. Like, how do you do this balance of the amount of assets that you have to create, the amount of story that you have to write, the number of scenes that you're making, the amount of code that you're doing, all of this stuff? How do you strike a balance between like effectively reusing materials and making sure that the player genuinely feels that they're making consequential decisions? And I think the shortcut here is, oh, character died, character didn't die. Isn't that a big impact? Isn't that a dramatic moment? And it is, sure. But it doesn't always hit that hard for me in retrospect. I feel like it's one of those things that feels satisfying in the moment, and then you look back at it and you go, "Oh, well, it could have been this the whole time." You know, like it wouldn't have changed that much. One scene would have played out differently, and then we reached the same ending broadly, no matter what. That's always odd to me. That's a really strange feeling. This feeling that the end of the game is the same, regardless of what you've been doing throughout the game. Every time that I attempt to imagine a game that is driven by consequences, I immediately go, okay, I'm never making that. Because I look at it in my brain and I go, okay, so then every time you make a decision, it has a butterfly effect, and now you have 1,000 different endings, and they have to all feel significantly different because they are significantly different, right? In life, one small decision can change everything. And so then when I'm thinking about writing a game, I'm like, any small decision is going to change everything, but we've got to narrow that scope in. That's wild. I don't know that I have a technique yet to satisfy the choices matter feeling in me. And so part of this episode is trying to suss that out a little bit. Let's dig deeper. Let's talk about a game that I feel is deeply impactful in its consequences. Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3, I feel that when I play Baldur's Gate 3, there's a genuine impact on everything I'm doing. And I'm not saying it's huge, and I've not beaten this game. I've only gotten through the first act on one playthrough, so I don't have something to compare it to. Maybe you've played it multiple times, maybe you've beaten the whole game, in which case you may have some more information than I do and might disagree or agree, depending. But as I'm playing through the first act, I feel like everything I'm doing matters and has pretty immediate consequences. And it's not that it's earth-shattering stuff, but it feels substantial. Every little interaction feels like it's going to have an impact, and I'm going to know what that impact is pretty quickly, which I think is essential, by the way. We'll get into that a little bit later. But immediate feedback is huge for making a consequence feel satisfying and fair. Baldur's Gate 3 does something right here. And I think it's the fact that it does feel like you're actually making choices. It doesn't feel like you're unlocking an extra scene or like an extra 4 lines of dialogue. It feels like you are entering a path that you can no longer leave, and you're choosing whether or not to go further down that path, and maybe you get a chance to abandon it, maybe you don't, but you are making a choice here, and you're kind of committing to it. You're going, this is the path we're going down, and I know that I'm going down this path, and I'm going to do it anyway. And there are a million reasons why I should and a million reasons why I shouldn't, and I'm going to go for it. In contrast, a lot of choices matter games are like, are you going to be nice or are you going to be mean? It's like, well, you're going to be nice. I don't really know what the side effect is, but I guess I'll just be good to this person. Like, it's always like this 2-option thing. And maybe I'm just stuck in this mindset because I just watched the Quarry gameplay. But it seems like it's pretty typical to not have that many options. And then the impact is essentially, do you get a little extra scene? Do you have a little extra challenge? Does the character die? Right? And that's a very different impact than here's a whole new quest line. There's another category in here that we're not even going to dig deep into, but I just want to mention. Open world games are weird when you factor them into this. When you think about open world games in terms of consequences, it's like they could have consequences, but then you're just allowed to explore absolutely everything, right? So you can kind of make your own structure here, but most people don't. You could say, I'm only going to go down this path, only down this path, whatever. And the consequences you're getting are just what you choose not to explore. So it's not locking you in. I don't think it's really giving an impact to your decisions. It's just letting you decide to explore whatever the heck you want. I think that's an interesting angle too. Why did I get so deep into thinking about the joy of consequences specifically? What is it about them that is joyful to me? I was playing Disco Elysium a while back, and I decided not to save scum. I always save scum, by the way. I'm always loading my games. I'm never dealing with the consequences of my actions in a CRPG. I'm exploring every option, and then I'm picking the one that I want to go down. I'm checking every I'm checking every single dialogue tree. And if it locks me down a path, I'm loading, checking the other path, and then deciding which one I want. I think it's because I don't trust the game. Like, I'm not willing to say, okay, this game is going to have me have a good time, even if I make a bad decision here. The designers have set this up for me to enjoy myself regardless of what decision I make here. I'm like, no, I have to make the perfect decision. I have to do the right thing. Otherwise, this game's not going to be fun for me. I have to do everything right. It has to be exactly right. And so when I was playing Disco Elysium, I was like, you know what, screw it. We're just going in. There's no way I'm going to be able to measure what's right and wrong here because this game is just nothing but an onslaught of weird moral choices and decisions, and it's going to mock you no matter what you choose. So I went in on that. Didn't do any loading. Didn't finish the game, by the way, but absolutely loved every minute I've spent with it so far. I intend to finish it at some point. It is marvelous when you don't save scum. I was like, every consequence, I keep going through the game and I go, oh my God, it's still so good. I've done horrible things. I've made really stupid decisions, and this game is still so enjoyable. Actually, now that I think about it, I stopped playing when I checked out a save scum thing. I reached a point and I went, I want to see what happens if I do this, that, the other. I decided to explore a little bit, and then it was like, oh, now I'm not having as much fun. Right? I was enjoying this because it was so consequential, but now that I'm, doing this thing where I get to foretell the future, I'm not enjoying it as much. It's not as fun of a game now. So there's a lot to think about there. There's so much to think about in terms of design. Oh my God. Like, it's really intimidating to jump into a game and say, hey, you only get one shot. Do not miss your chance. And that's terrifying. That may not appeal to a bunch of gamers. Like, you may want to go, no, I want to load. Let me load. Why don't I get to load? Especially if you've designed it in a way where some of the decisions are going to be frustrating, where the player is going to go, ooh, that's not what I meant to do, and the game misinterpreted my choice, or that's not what I thought the game was going to do when I chose that. That can be pretty harsh. And now, this may seem a little unrelated, but I want to mention Diablo II. There was something about Diablo II that I found so deeply satisfying as a kid, and it was making new characters. I've always loved making a new character, and more recently, games have made it a lot easier to re-roll your character, and that's good in a lot of ways. They're respecting your time, but there's a value in making a bad character and then going, oh, I gotta remake my whole freaking character. There's a joy in going, oh, I screwed up my character build, but now I've learned this and now I can try again and do better. Whereas just going, oh, these abilities aren't working for me. Let me just hit reset on this and swap out my abilities. That was the thing in Diablo 3 that just did not work for me. I could just swap out all my skills, so then I never planned a build. I never really cared about it. I never got that concerned with it. And that is kind of a gameplay version of this joy of consequences thing. I was happy eventually with the fact that my character was bad, because later I learned how to make a good character and I enjoyed that. And maybe this is just not the time for that kind of game design anymore. Maybe there are so many options that if a game is not respecting your time on that level, if a game is saying, no, you have to learn this hard lesson and then come back around, maybe that doesn't land for people. And I say that, and then I immediately think of Dark Souls, and I go, you know what? Maybe it does land. Maybe the game doesn't have to respect your time. Maybe the game can punish the ever-living crap out of you, and then you can feel really good for overcoming these challenges. So I find that absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure what more there is to say about that, other than the fact that your investment in your character matters, and your investment in the story matters, and the length of time that you've been going down one path matters, and making a choice that has knock-on consequences over a long period of time is enjoyable, even if the consequences are negative, as long as they make sense and seem fair. Let's think for a moment about how to create fair consequences, how to create situations in which you can punish the player for a bad decision, but have the player go, no, that's fair, that makes sense, and have them decide to stick with it and live with it. There's the Disco Elysium angle of having everything be so morally cloudy that there's no decision that's going to be a good decision, and you just have to go down the path. Right? It forces you to go, okay, there's no good. There's just choices, and I'm going to choose what I think is best, and this is going to be rough, right? That's one angle for it. That's one angle to make sure that your player doesn't get caught in this like paralysis paralysis, excuse me. Now, I think a few other things make it satisfying. I think immediate feedback is extremely useful here. Players want to learn what happens when they take an action. At least I do, and I'm pretty sure you do too. When you're playing a game, you don't want it to be up in the air. You don't want this floaty thing that happens 4 hours later. You find out 4 hours later that you made a mistake and you go, God dang it. Like, that's not a moment where you go, that's so fair and so satisfying. You go, man, I wish I had known that like 3.5 hours ago. Like, really? 4 hours later I get punished for that? That's ridiculous. It doesn't feel good. Whether or not it's realistic, right? It doesn't feel good. As a game, right? We don't have to stick to just realism. Like, it may make perfect sense that you've made this decision and then it has a consequence 4 hours later in game hours. But that doesn't mean that it's enjoyable. And I find that very interesting because something in the back of my head was like, oh no, we want decisions to have consequences. So anytime that somebody makes a decision, there should be a consequence at some point. But we don't want that consequence to happen at a point where the player's already forgotten about the decision, because then they're like, why is this happening? Oh, because I did this long ago? That kind of sucks. Or if there is a consequence, so I don't stick firmly to this. I don't think that is like a hard and fast rule. I think if there is a consequence, it should be small enough that it's just an interesting thing, right? It shouldn't be, you made this mistake 4 hours ago and here's a massive punishment for it. But it could be, you made this decision 4 hours ago and hey, look at this cool little room that you just unlocked, right? Here's this little reward for that decision that you made. And I wonder how much it matters whether a delayed consequence is positive or negative. I have a feeling that if it's positive, it's a nice little surprise. And if it's negative, you go, well, I can't go back and fix that. And you get annoyed at it. Unless it's very small. That's just a feeling I have. That's just a thought. Something to chew on there. Just a little thought to consider. How would you feel if you got a small negative consequence 4 hours after a decision that was clearly tied to that decision versus a small positive consequence? In terms of game design, not just in terms of, like, is it frustrating or is it going to be a satisfying negative consequence, right? Like, does that make sense? There's a joy in a negative consequence that makes sense, that feels like, oh, I made that mistake. Is that going to be a moment where you go, oh man, the game's punishing me for this and it makes so much sense? Or is it going to be a moment where you go, man, the game's punishing me for this and it's so stupid and it doesn't add anything? Because I think it could be one or the other, and it's going to depend on the implementation and all this other stuff. Speaking of frustrating consequences, I don't like being locked out of an area of a game permanently. I don't like having something completely shut off to me. I find that extremely frustrating. So if that's going to happen, I need to know immediately, and I need to know what caused it so that I can change it if I want to. On the other hand, if it does happen, but there's a reason why it's a good thing, then maybe it's not as frustrating. If it's like, you are shut out of this area forever, but instead you get this. If it's a trade-off, that feels good. If it's just locking you out, that doesn't feel that good. Like, if it's like shoving it in your face, you're not going to get to experience this content, that sucks. But if just low-key you're not going to experience that, and we're not going to like bug you with it or anything, right? Like, it's just a path you didn't choose. And that's kind of cool. I'm almost imagining a secret room, like a bank vault or something, and you hit a button and then the gate to the bank vault just seals completely shut, and it's like, this content is no longer available to you. And it's just like 20 hours into the game, right? Like, oh great, what, I'm going to replay the first 20 hours just to get here, see what's inside of there, and then be underwhelmed by it because I just put 20 hours of investment into replaying this? Like, I'm going to keep alternative saves? I have to keep like a whole freaking spreadsheet? What do I got to do to experience this? That seems like something that would frustrate me. But to flip it, to make it something satisfying, would just be like, instead of going into this bank vault, you get to enter this like other area. Does that make sense? It's literally fork in the road design. Like, I think there is something to be said for which bank vault do you want to go into versus just do you get to go into this bank vault. And I know when I phrase it that way, it seems very straightforward and very simple, but I think this connects with this idea of, oh, you make this decision, it just unlocks a little bit of extra scene stuff. That to me is closing or opening the door to a bank vault. You're closing or opening the door to a bit of content without any real trade-off. That's odd. I don't like that. I want the reward. I want the player to be rewarded for their choice, no matter what the choice is. So maybe you are punished and rewarded. Maybe the punishment is the reward. Maybe it's such a satisfying bit of lore within the punishment that it's extremely rewarding for you. But I don't like this idea of making the wrong choice as a player. And it's very important to design consequences in a way that lets the player trust you. I think I can stand pretty firm on that. If the player doesn't trust you, they're going to be save loading. They're going to be checking everything. They're going to be making sure that the game is letting them have fun. So that's going to be tricky. And that's definitely something to think about. But I know I've played games where I trust the designers more than other games. There are absolutely games that I play and I go, oh, I'm going to have a good time. It's fine. If I go into Baldur's Gate 3 and somebody's like, do a no load run, I'll be like, yeah, 100%, let's go. I'm going to enjoy this game, right? It's going to be fun. Even if I get locked out of things, even if this happens, that happens, the other happens, I'm going to trust this. It'll be fine. And they even give you a few, like, the one problem with that would be like some rolls. Like if you just get some BS rolls, but even that, they give you like ways to re-roll kind of built in and you get a certain number of chances. So that's not bad, right? So I trust that a lot. There are other games that I just don't think I would trust and I would end up loading a lot. And they're even good games, but there are situations where I'd be like, I don't know if that path is going to be as fun for me. I'm just going to load. And the last point I want to talk about in terms of game design is proving impact, because I think this is a weird thing. I think that showing the player the impact of their choices is a very tricky, delicate balance, because you risk showing them what they missed out on. So I don't know if we need to do it. I got to think about that. I don't know if you have like 12 paths that your player can go down, if you have all these different options that they can go down, do you need to show them the path not taken? Or do you just leave that for a replay? And you say some players are going to experience, some players aren't going to experience it. And then here's my thought. I think the way that we show the impact of your decisions is just by making everything that happens actually be impacted by your decisions. I think the player will notice, because they'll be playing and they're going to go, well, obviously that's not something that would have been said to me had I chosen the other path. Obviously this isn't something that I would have had access to had I chosen the other path. This character might have been dead. This character might not have liked me. I may not have had access to this area because somebody told me about this secret, whatever. Like, I think that you don't have to have this like automatic black and white. It is clear that if you do this, this person dies. If you don't do this, they survive. I don't think you need that if the world is alive enough that it's very clear that all of your decisions are changing the way that you interact with the rest of the world. Now, is that easy to do? No. Is that viable in most cases? Probably not, honestly. But I do think it's fascinating. I suspect that choices matter games are like the hardest thing to make really well. I think creating a game that has multiple endings and your decisions actually had a real impact on the endings, that has got to be one of the toughest things in game dev, because of the sheer number of possibilities and the amount of stuff that you have to do to make this feasible. Like, There are so many instances of games that claim that your choices matter, and then they just don't, right? Like you finish the game and you're like, okay, I have a different ending cutscene. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, cool. So nothing actually mattered. I think that is like one of the most common things that I see people complain about is like this game said my choices matter and they just don't. They just don't matter. I also think that's one of the reasons why Baldur's Gate 3 was such a smash success is because from the first moment it felt like every decision I made mattered. It's also why I love classic RPGs. This is a very D&D thing. Making your choices actually matter is such a Dungeons and Dragons move because you can improvise when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that's why I think that the CRPG genre executes it so well, right? I think they're really, that's the version of this that resonates with me the most. And then when you look at a game that's like pretty successful outside of that, you look at something like The Quarry or Until Dawn, it's successful because it's a satisfying horror game and your choices have a heavy impact in that moment. And that's great. But then if you look back at it from the lens that I'm looking at it from right now, of like replayability and all this other stuff, I'm like, I'm not so sure that those are replayable. Like I'm pretty sure there's like one path for those games because they're effectively movies. I think that's really fascinating. I wonder what it would be like if one of those games really took inspiration from the CRPG genre, What would it just turn into something like Mass Effect? I've never played Mass Effect, but my understanding is that is a significant choice-driven game. Would it just turn into a CRPG? What if it was just a movie game, like Until Dawn or The Quarry or whatever? What if you just made a movie-style game, Heavy Rain, and then had it have the level of consequence of a game like Baldur's Gate 3? And maybe I'm speaking from a place of ignorance. Maybe I'm missing something here because I didn't play Heavy Rain, but I've watched gameplay of Detroit Become Human, The Quarry, and Until Dawn. I've seen full playthroughs of all of those games, and it seems like there's a consistent pattern here of not quite having the satisfying level of consequence that something like a Baldur's Gate 3 has. Something like a Disco Elysium or a Planescape Torment. And I just wonder if there's a good melding of those genres, a good in between, or if the asset load is simply too high for a game that's a much more like cinematic experience, like a much more narrative driven cinematic experience. Yeah, I don't know. I guess those are just some additional thoughts that I have about it. But what I do think is giving the player consequences is essential. Giving them immediate feedback, giving them some level of satisfaction, and not rubbing it in their face whenever they make the wrong decision too aggressively, and showing them that, hey, you may have made the wrong decision, but it's going to lead to some interesting stuff later. Getting them to trust that you're going to give them a good experience, even if they did something really stupid, even if something really bad is happening, making sure that even the bad stuff is deeply satisfying. I think all of that, excuse me, I may have bumped the mic there. I think all of that is extremely important. All right, let's wrap this up with a couple questions just to kind of get you thinking. First question for this week is, what in-game choices do you find most satisfying? Because this episode is mostly coming from my own perspective, but it may be the case for you that you want a choice that's deeply punishing and rubs it in your face, right? This is just my own angle. So what in-game choices do you find most satisfying? What genres have really satisfying choices for you? Are they gameplay choices? Are they story-based choices? Do you like an open world thing where you just get to explore and make your own choices without having any kind of a tree presented to you? Next question. Do you prefer experiencing every option or embracing one path? Like, do you want to 100%? If you've got a multi-path game, do you want to go back and re-experience everything? Do you check everything before you decide on a path? Or do you just want to go in blind and go, let's see what happens? Right? Because I've had so much fun with the second version that jumping in and seeing what happens now that I've actually given it a shot. Because I used to always check everything. And then I've got a tip for myself from all of this, which is just to roll with the consequences. Because I've enjoyed doing that in games and I don't do it often enough. So just to go in there, see what happens and roll with it. I think it's a good time. I think it's a nice way to experience games, especially when you're not used to it. That's everything I got for you this week. Thank you for listening to this one. I appreciate you. I'm still on Twitch. I'm still doing the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern schedule. We've got the Discord. We've got this podcast. And one day I may put out a YouTube video. We're starting to look at that. We're starting to peek in on that a little bit. But I'll see you all around. Thanks for listening. Get out there, make some stuff, and have fun with it. Bye-bye.